All right, good afternoon. We will get started. All right, we want to welcome everyone to our Safety and Security Committee meeting. We'll call this meeting to order. It is approximately 3:08. So I want to welcome everyone. I think we have a full complement of board members today with us. Our Vice Chair Cash, Ms. Vice Chair Cash, Dr. Martin, Ms. Kushner, Ms. Mahaffey, of course, Superintendent Moore here with us in the room. And then I think we are joined by board members Hegarty, Fletcher, and Scott virtual. So good afternoon to you all as well virtually. All right, we will get started and get into our agenda. First item of business is approval of our committee meeting minutes from the September 30th meeting. So we are a committee of the whole, so anybody is welcome to make that motion.
I make a motion to approve those minutes.
Second.
All right, got a motion from Mrs. Cash and a second from Dr. Martin. Any discussion? All those in favor, show by sign of aye.
Aye.
All right. Any opposed, nay? Ayes have it, those minutes are approved. All right, well, I will turn it over to our staff liaison, which is Dr. Gardner, our Chief of Staff and Strategic Planning, and he will kick us off with this afternoon's agenda.
Good afternoon, Chair Sutton, Superintendent Moore, and members of the board, both here in person as well as those who are joining us virtually. If I could ask our team to go ahead and display our slide deck, I will review our agenda and our desired outcomes that we are going to accomplish this afternoon. Our meeting really is divided into three sections today, focusing on each of the desired outcomes that I will share with you. Today, upon the conclusion of our meeting, we hope to have a deeper understanding about district initiatives related to restorative practices and programs. This is a direct response to when we were mapping out the scope of our work for this committee that the board wanted to have more information around as a foundation as we look at other programming down the path with regard to our work in the Safety and Security Committee. We'll also receive greater insight into the training SROs received. This also was a direct request from the members of the board as we were mapping out the scope of the work for this committee. We will revisit a presentation that we made earlier on one of our work sessions and or the first meeting that we were with you about our trend data for referral offenses. Specifically, it was a request to do a greater breakdown between our middle and high schools. So these are the three desired outcomes that will serve for our work this afternoon together, and it's a pleasure to be with you. I'll first introduce our speaker, Paul Coe, Assistant Superintendent of Student Support Services. He will be joined virtually by Morris Pettiford, Senior Director in Counseling and Student Services, as well as some other members of the team who I will let Paul Coe introduce when he steps forward. He will be providing information this afternoon specifically to restorative practices. Welcome, Mr. Coe, and thank you and your team for being here.
Thank you, Dr. Gardner. Good afternoon, Chair Sutton, Superintendent Moore, members of the board. As Dr. Gardner indicated, we're bringing an information item in restorative practices that you've indicated an interest in this committee. So we wanted to present an overview of restorative practices and what we're up to in this work. And so joining me virtually are Dr. Marius Pettiford, Senior Director of Counseling and Student Services, Colleen Fitzpatrick, Restorative Practices Coordinator, and Misty Southern, Restorative Practices Facilitator. First, we wanted to review what restorative practices is. RP, as we often call it, refers to a range of approaches and tools to build connections, strengthen communities, and resolve issues with a focus on repairing relationships. This is about a mindset shift from punitive to restorative with the needs of the whole school community in mind. And within restorative practices, we want to note that there are two key elements. First, our circle process is the focus of our restorative practices team in our district, who work with schools to focus on relationship building and creating a foundation within school communities of knowing one another, and our team offers extensive training and coaching in this area. Another element is facilitated dialogue and mediations that is offered in partnership with the Campbell Law Restorative Justice Clinic, offering mediation services for schools to help mediate conflict through a restorative process. With both of these elements, it's important to note that one of the key tenets of restorative practices is that RP is invitational and not presented as a mandate. To reiterate the invitational nature of restorative practices circles, we've listed here how circles can be used in a school setting with students, families, community, and staff. Our trained circle keepers facilitate intentional gatherings with fidelity that is learned by taking the mandatory training within our school district to have the foundational skills to facilitate circles. Circle practice, when conducted regularly, is a preventative tool for encouraging each individual's truth and perspective, along with the benefits of the above, the bulleted items listed here. This photo shows an elementary school with their staff connecting with one another in an opening ceremony. When we know someone's story, we are less likely to pass judgment. Creating a space where participants can connect with one another allows us to know people at a human level. And I want to reiterate here that the purpose of circles is not group therapy, rather to build connection and empathy in schools and our community through relationships. So our focus in WCPSS is circles for staff, students, and families and communities. And the goal of circles, again, within our schools is to deepen connections in hopes of reducing conflicts and harm by being more aware of the individual stories and truths we carry in the space of school. When looking at restorative practices from a perspective with tiers, at the Tier 1 level, circles is a tool that is offered to all students. Our restorative practices team coaches and trains circle keepers for this Tier 1 work. At the Tier 2 level, we're focusing on building capacity of our student services teams to address ongoing issues using a restorative lens that may look like circles for understanding, support circles, celebration circles, honoring circles, grief circles, and reintegration circles. At the Tier 3 level, our RP team and our community partner, Campbell Law Restorative Justice Clinic, supports the needs of a school when there has been conflict or harm. And in this slide, you'll see the logic model that we've outlined in our plan for full implementation in Wake County Public School System. We began with the resources and inputs we currently use in order to build restorative practices in each school. With these resources, we are able to implement the following actions that train and equip educators and community members in restorative practices. Our intermediate objectives allow for coaching and implementation in all WCPSS schools with the overall outcome to improve behavioral and social emotional outcomes for all members of our school community. In this next slide, you'll see a year-to-year growth rate for the RP team that they continue to strengthen capacity and knowledge of our work with restorative practices in all 192 schools. As recently as last week, the restorative practices team offered the opportunity of staff circles in all Wake County public schools in hopes of making this a common practice for all school communities in our return to in-person. You'll see here the growth trajectory that started during the 18-19 school year through the support of our Kellogg grant that focused on Tier 1 circles in elementary schools. It also included coaching in 6 elementary schools, training across elementary, middle, and high schools, and we were active in that year with restorative practices in 49 schools. The work then moved into the 2019-2020 school year with a broadening of our reach to include coaching and training across elementary, middle, and high schools, restorative practices mediation in middle schools and high schools, and our work was active in 132 schools across all 9 regional areas. In the 2020-2021 school year, our work is still focused on Tier 1 circles in all schools, coaching in all 9 regional areas, ongoing trainings for circles and mediation, and our hopes are to be active in all 192 schools. And over these last 3 years, I wanted to take note that the number of trained circle keepers across our district grew from 215 trained circle keepers to 723. In this slide, you'll see our intended outcomes and the data points from our external evaluation process. Our first intended outcome was to lower suspension rates. When measuring the 2017-18 school year suspension data as compared to the 18-19 school year data for our initial Kellogg grant schools, we see that suspensions were moved from 292 to 83, which shows a 72% reduction in suspensions. With our intended outcome to develop more compassion and empathy and connection through our external evaluator surveys, teachers and staff reported a 51% to 65% increase in connectedness amongst each other. With our intended outcome of strengthening relationships with staff, students, parents, and community, our teachers and staff also reported a 51% to 65% increase in feeling connected to students. In our outcome to move our approach and discipline from punitive to proactive, our external evaluator perception surveys noted an increase in the proactive approaches in our schools engaged in restorative practices. In our outcome of increased student engagement, our staff perception survey responses also noted an increase in student engagement. We're continuing to collect data through an external evaluation process that began with our 18-month Kellogg grant and continued in the 1920 school year that evaluated programs outside of our initial Kellogg grant schools. And in the next slide, you'll see some of the qualitative data we collected during the 1920 school year. However, due to COVID, the evaluation process was interrupted, but we will continue to evaluate our restorative practices programs going forward. And in this slide, you'll see that our outside evaluation company collected qualitative survey results, and the overall impact of restorative practices falls into these four main categories that you see here, which are better understanding of each other, a greater sense of ownership and voice, more sharing, better listening, building a community and a space for problem solving. With this promising data, we also want to remind you here in this slide the steps we continue to take to support staff and students in the work of restorative practices. For this year, one of the first steps we took was to help schools transition back with both our staff and students, focusing on their social and emotional well-being. We also sent out a survey to all circle keepers for interest in leading staff circles in schools. Despite the pandemic, we've expanded our training opportunities virtually and continue to conduct refresher courses for trained circle keepers and provide a return to school kit for student circles. Our next steps include a restorative practices training in the spring of 2021, which is at the tier 2 level, the restorative responses, I mean. And then we're going to continue our work with school-specific restorative practices plans and continue to build up the number of trained circle keepers at each school and maintain our trainers in a database to support our work of building our district's capacity. Also, we are continuing to look at how we can support and continue our work with our SROs. Similar to what was worked on 5 to 6 years ago, we want to offer our RP training to our SROs that is also coupled with the mental health and crisis trainings we've completed with them over the last few years. So with that, I will pause for any questions.
Thank you for that, Mr. Coe. And Dr. Gardner touched on it, but I just want to sort of reiterate the fact that part of our rationale for starting this off with a presentation around the restorative practices are that some of the options that we'll be reviewing going forward in terms of Peace Builders programs and some others are rooted in restorative practices. So we wanted to provide sort of this baseline of information about restorative practices as we look to some of the options that we'll be reviewing as a committee around the safety and security of our schools. So are there any, two other things I want to mention. Ms. Johnson-Haas is also with us online. I failed to mention her earlier as well. And also welcome Mara O'Keefe, who's our attorney with us today, who works with many of our restorative practices, the discipline programs, community justice partnerships, and all that. So welcome and hey to you as well.
It's like a Zoom call. We have to wait.
So we'll start with questions. Mrs. Cash.
Other people probably know this now. Circle keeper, how are they, is there one per school?
So there's actually potentially several in a school, and I can actually have our team jump in to share more what that looks like. But The staff members who are interested would attend the initial trainings that orient them about all the foundational practices that are needed to know how to keep circle, either with staff or students. And there's regular trainings that go on, on a monthly basis that folks who are interested in any school can partake in to bring back to the school. And often what we've seen is that when there are even a few circle keepers that do the practices in a school, when other colleagues see the practices yielding benefits that are great for both students and staff, word will get spread, and then other folks will want to get trained. And so a school over time, it depends on the school, but could rapidly get the training, and almost all the teachers may become circle keeper trained.
Thank you.
Mrs. Mahaffey.
Thank you. Mr. Coe, I don't necessarily have a question, as I've seen this in practice in my daughter's classroom, and I want to say, as a parent, hearing, the answers to questions and what they come home with, and the further questions that come to our house has really helped conversations for our family at the dinner table, and my children to learn to connect with the students and their peers in their classroom. I'm encouraged to see the 3 levels and just the complexity of each of those different types of circles, because I think it helps lay out what the understanding of where we are and where we can go with this once that foundation is built. And I'm excited for the next steps of having those school-specific restorative practice plans, because I know, in just seeing the data, this is something that's very favorable by many of our teachers and school staff. And so the fact that this will be available for parents and teachers to see what is happening at their school in terms of restorative practices is really encouraging. And you and your team have done a phenomenal job getting this program off the ground and getting it to just catch across the district. And it's been almost like I hate to say, wildfire, but really just spreading and positive news across our district is really, really encouraging. So thank you all.
Thank you, Ms. Mahaffey. And just to note that I think we have a small team, but it's a very mighty team led by both Dr. Pettiford and Colleen Fitzpatrick. And I think despite the human resource challenges, they believe in this so much that they are continuing to plug away no matter what and trying to get more and more folks trained and onboarded.
Thank you, Ms. Mahaffey. Ms. Kushner.
Thank you, Chair Sutton, and thank you, Mr. Coe, for this presentation. Anyone knows me knows I love kindergarten. And so you think of the circle time that our kindergarten students share, and this is sort of following that model that students building relationships with each other, learning from each other, sharing ideas with each other, and giving that student voice that we keep talking about. So I'm pleased to see this presentation. I do have concerns about, I'm glad that we're scaling this across schools, because that was an early concern from when we started restorative practices, specifically with the Tier 3 activities, is the scaling. So how will we be able to scale that level of work? Because I think that's where we're going to reach that biggest outcomes, with reducing suspensions, with giving our students some voice and agency over behavioral disruptions that isn't a suspension. So what steps are we taking to scale that level 3, that Tier 3?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Ms. Kushner. I think the first thing is to not, we want to continue with the work that we have to make sure that we're growing it as much as we're able to, but it's also, I think, about maintaining our partnership with the Campbell Law Restorative Justice Clinic, because I think they bring in a set of resources both through John Powell and Joya that also brings in the law students from Campbell Law that become resources for our schools who are thinking of a different way to address conflict, whether that was like a shouting match in the hallway or a really hard fight that happened on campus. And I think the next steps are to increase both, like continue the kind of like the advertising of what's available when things like that occur that are through our CAST team and our restorative practices team. These resources are available to schools to opt into. But I think secondly is also about increasing our human capacity, so that we can grow this team a little bit bigger than just the 3 folks that are there. And so I think that's something that we've been looking into, but we know that money doesn't fall from trees, so we're going to be patient with it, but still rely on our team to continue this work.
Thank you. And we have to build on that Tier 1. I fully recognize that,
Yeah.
but Mr. Powell and the Campbell folks have done such great work, so I'm glad that they have also continued to give us that support and training. So thank you, Mr. Coe. Thank you, Chair.
If I may, just very quickly, what is the Campbell Law capacity? Do they still have capacity for growing to more schools? Are they saturated?
So I would say right now they're still looking to grow, and anytime we've had a need, even if it's like a school that maybe doesn't regularly practice restorative practices per se, but a conflict comes on our radar, and we do reach out to the school along with the area superintendents to say, hey, this is an option to address this conflict. Do you want to link up with Campbell Law? So anytime we've made those requests, they've never said no.
Good to know. Thank you.
Yep.
So, Mr. Coe?
Ms. Johnson-Hostler.
Thank you, Mr. Sutton, and thank you, Dr. Coe. As always, you know that I'm a huge supporter of our restorative practices and your small but mighty team who does the work. So my question is a little bit expanding on both Ms. Kushner and Dr. Martin's question regarding Campbell Law. I'm glad to hear that they're not necessarily at capacity or maxed. But one of the questions I've never asked, and I was curious about, and didn't get the opportunity to ask Mr. Powell last time I saw him, but have we considered looking at our other surrounding law schools to talk to them about starting clinics? All of our law schools have different clinics, and this feels like one that would be important, one, because we have a historically black college and university with the law school that I think would be a great partner so that students could see people look like them involved in this process. And so I'm just curious if we've talked about, and of course, law clinics are free services because it's a part of their law school training. So I'm just curious if we've thought about expanding it that way, given money isn't falling from the trees, to grow the team that I certainly believe that Dr. Pettiford and his team needs to grow. But that's another option that would not potentially cost us, but could be another extension of a partnership. So that's my first question, to think about that. And then the second question I'll go ahead and ask, because this may be for Dr. Pettiford, but I'm curious if we've thought about, for parents who have been curious or not sure what circles or restorative practices look like, have we thought about offering some mini sessions similar to the community restorative practices that Dr. Pettiford and his team led, as an opportunity for parents to actually experience the circles, to hopefully kind of douse some of the caution that people tend to have around these practices.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Ms. Johnson-Hostler. I saw a chat pop up that Dr. Pettiford can answer the first question, and I believe he might be able to answer the second as well.
Thank you. I did want to go back to the scalability of the program with Campbell Law. We've been in numerous conversations with them about building the capacity of our team to do some of those Tier 3 mediation components, and then also providing that training to staff that are ready. We naturally have some staff like counselors, social workers, who could easily, with the training, take on some of those components of the mediation piece. So we've been working on that model as well. The expansion to other law schools, I know that John Powell has had conversations with Central and also with I know most recently with Elon, and there was maybe one other school. He hasn't gained the traction with some of those law schools like he would like, but I'm sure, knowing John, he hasn't given up on that. So that's sort of where we are with that component. But we are trying to build the capacity of our current team to really address the scalability of things, focusing on the Tier 1, and then how to move forward with Tier 2 conflict training, and then also the mediation component for Tier 3.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson-Hostler. Mr. Carr, I had a question. Going back to slide 10, I think it was, most of you had your data talked about the connections with students and that sort of thing, but it at least appears on this slide that most of that input came from teacher or staff surveys. I was wondering, had there been a survey or any input from students and how they felt about some of these outcomes in terms of success that we've had in terms of strengthening relationships with staff and students, the proactive versus punitive approach, the increased student engagement, development of more compassion and empathy, the connection. Do we have any input from students with regard to any of these?
Yeah, so our team is actually most directly involved with the external evaluation process. So I'll also pass it to Dr. Pettiford or Colleen Fitzpatrick to jump in and answer if we're getting student perception data.
Yeah, so that's a great question. We actually were planning to do that for this next phase of training. We wanted to first work on getting feedback from the adults to make sure that was happening to fidelity. And this year was targeted for the evaluation component from the students' perspective. Of course, now that we're in the times that we are in, we, postponed that particular evaluation, and we'll probably do some more anecdotal evaluation of that through our progress monitoring tool that we normally have to submit for data research and accountability. So we're going to fold that process in for this year because we are working with schools that are doing circle work virtually. And so we're going to take a look at that and see what kind of student response we get. We would prefer to get that information when everyone's in person. So I think that would give us some better results, but we'll see what we can get from this year and know that that's something that we're going to continue to get as student feedback. And also the component of high schools, training them to become, to mediate situations. That's also, the research shows that that's an effective strategy as well.
Okay. That would be helpful, just saying to me, for making authentic connections, be that both sides are feeling that we're connected as opposed to getting an input from one side.
Yes, Chair Sutton, and I think something else that it makes me think about is also like the student surveys that we have district-wide at the 4th, 8th, and 9th grade level. That's also a data point from student surveys of students who are from schools who have engaged in restorative practices to also triangulate that data as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Ms. Cass, did you have another question?
So just like, I think you and I talked a minute about this, Dr. Cole, like in an elementary school, would all kids be involved in a circle, or how do parents know? Like, what does an elementary school look like with restorative practice and circles?
So usually, that's a great question. And so from what I've seen, like, for example, I think the first month I came on, I got to visit Timber Drive and got into a second grade classroom with Colleen Fitzpatrick and the teacher. And they were about to have a field day that day. This is pre-COVID times. And I think the teacher set it up so that all the students sat in a circle, and it's, of course, invitational. So if a student is not feeling like they want to take part in circle, they can opt out, and we don't make them do the circle practice. But that particular circle was just reflective questions about how they're feeling at the end of the year, and then what they're excited for around like what they're about to do with this Timber Drive field day. And I think that's what it looks like, and it's up to the teacher who gets coaching from our restorative practices team to understand how to set up the routines and structures so that students are onboarded appropriately. And also, we try to teach them the same tenets that we've shared with you here, is that there is an invitational approach to restorative practices, and we want to make sure they understand the why, is that we're mainly trying to make sure that they understand how to be connected with each other through a relationship and understand each other, of like, we have to be able to express like where they're at, where they come from, what's their story, so that they understand that if something goes wrong or they have a hard moment with each other, they're able to actually have that background understanding foundationally so that hopefully conflicts are resolved more restoratively and not through other means.
So thank you for that. If you had a restorative practice elementary school, would all the parents in that school have been, like, would their kids have all been involved at some point in the circle?
I'm going to actually, yeah, so I think that's a good question. Because we have experts here, I'm going to actually pass it to Colleen Fitzpatrick to see if she wants to add anything around how that looks at the school level.
Yes, I'm happy to address that. So could you just repeat your question just one more time? I want to make sure that I'm hitting the right part on that. I'm sorry.
Well, if you had a restorative elementary school, would I expect that all the parents' children would have had some, would have heard about it or been involved in it at some point, or would parents? Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for that question. So the schools that I'm affiliated with and the schools that I'm doing work in, it usually is a common knowledge that some of their staff have been trained as circle keepers, and it's a way of doing kind of business in their classroom and having time similar to a class meeting, but it's done in a way that students have a voice and they're given turns, they're given an opportunity to share. They're invited to a place where, as a trained circle keeper, there's an element of being prepared with questions or ways of navigating conversations to help kids along. But it is something that is addressed individually as a teacher. Let parents know that they've been trained as a circle keeper, and that's how they manage some of the protocols in their classroom, or it could be invited as something that's offered as a school level.
Okay, thank you. So all kids would have been aware of it. They have availability, all kids in that school.
If there are trained circle keepers in that school, if their teachers are trained circle keepers, they would invite students into a circle space so that they're aware that they're having what's called circle, and there's a just different protocol, if you will, in order for them to feel a safe space and share.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Also, if I could add, we did open an elementary school this year in a restorative model, South Lakes Elementary School, where most everybody has been trained to be circle keepers. So more than likely in a school where that is just part of the culture, more kids are going to be exposed to that. In other elementary schools, it kind of depends on who's trained in the school. Like as a counselor, they might go into classrooms and do it with classrooms where teachers are not trained. So it just kind of depends on who is trained in the school, whether or not people would be exposed to that, if you will. But South Lakes Elementary School, it's just part of their culture. So and we're hoping to get more schools on that track, if you will, and that will expose more kids to that and families as well. So that is something that we do also, is just circles with families so they do know about it. A lot of times the principals will ask us to do like PTA circles and things like that, so the parents are aware of what it feels like and what it looks like, and hopefully that they can use that tool in their homes as well to kind of deepen those connections and kind of build off of what they did at school.
Thank you, Mrs. Cash. Mrs. Scott.
Thank you for that. Thank you. I'm a little curious about the differences between, a tier 1 circle. I think many of our teachers right now are experienced toward the end of Zoom calls, where students might want to just talk or just have a conversation about something or share what they're feeling. And I don't really, I can certainly, I'm just wondering when does that become something that would be considered more circle? When is that something that's just the natural part of a conversation within a classroom? Because looking at the multi-tiers on slide 7, I mean, many of the aspects of the tier 1 are really just kind of natural conversations that happen within a classroom. And I certainly understand that tiers 2 and 3 we're talking about where it absolutely is crucial and probably more of an opt-in to begin with. as was described. So I'm just wondering, how does that work, and how does that also layer on top of the MTSS?
So thank you for that question, Ms. Scott. I think I'll have our team jump in as well, but I think the general approach is as you described, where we want to make sure that our students with restorative practices have a basic foundation at that Tier 1 level where they understand the tenets and the whys of restorative practices. And then as we go into the Tier 2 or Tier 3, it's when there are problems that need to be resolved in different ways, and we're hoping that at the Tier 2 level, there are smaller groups that are targeted towards specific topics that help resolve conflict, whereas at the Tier 3 level is when conflict or harm has become very major that needs to be addressed. But I'll also, again, pass it to our team to see if they have anything to add to the details you asked about.
Sure, I can address that, Ms. Scott. Really, the focus of our work is Tier 1, and what we find is when we make those human connections, even in classrooms or situations where there is conflict, when we know somebody's story, we're less likely to harm them or be in conflict with them. So a lot of times we will go into classrooms because there are issues, if you will, but we stay in that Tier 1, like getting to know, your favorite color or, something that you enjoy doing in your free time, things like that. And then they're building connections with people, and they're talking about things that they probably wouldn't talk about, without this. And what we encourage is a lot of times conversations or ideas will start in circle, but go have a conversation on the playground or on the bus about something that you learned about somebody that you have things in common with. So that really is kind of the focus, just the Tier 1 work. And we can talk about issues once the trust is developed there. Like, it's not something that we force. Even if you participate in a circle and we ask a question and you don't have an answer or don't want to respond, you can pass without any repercussions from that, because we want people to feel comfortable to talk when they're ready.
And then, Ms. Scott, something else I might add is that, as Misty was saying, the focus is at that Tier 1 level, but we have Campbell Law, particularly at that Tier 3 level, who comes in with the mediation services and facilitated dialogue. And at the Tier 2 level, that's where we're actually trying to build more capacity so that, for example, I mentioned in one of the last slides that the restorative responses that's at the Tier 2 level particularly with our student services teams is something that we want to build more capacity in schools, so that there's also an intermediary step, so it's not just Tier 1 or Tier 3, but there's an intermediary step that our student services team and even administrators can take part in to help resolve conflict before it escalates to a serious issue.
Thank you.
All right. I don't see any further questions on this topic. So, Dr. Coe, thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Pettiford, Dr. Pettiford and team, thank you for you all being here as well. I think next up is the SRO training piece, and that is Russ Smith and Kendrick Scott.
Good afternoon, Chair Sutton, Superintendent Moore, and Board of Education members. The topic for this presentation is going to be SRO training, which is based upon feedback that we've received from you prior. I'm going to start by laying a little bit of a foundation of what type of training an SRO has received prior to being placed and will be getting once assigned to a school. Per the requirements of the SRO MOU, each SRO must be a certified law enforcement officer in North Carolina. To maintain that state certification, all officers are required to complete annual in-service training. Per the MOU, the SROs must complete school resource officer training, as well as crisis intervention team training, or CIT training. So in reference to the state-mandated training, North Carolina Administrative Code requires that every officer shall annually receive in-service training consisting of 24 hours, and this training is required in order for them to maintain their state certification. So the topics of 14 of those hours are mandated by the state. For example, for 2021, school safety and responding to school incidents makes up 4 of those 14 hours. Okay. The remaining 10 hours of in-service training that agencies provide is decided upon by the local agency based upon their needs. As we were reaching out to get this information, many agencies reported having in-service training for officers related to diversity and inclusion. Next is the school resource officer curriculum training that's required per the MOU. It's a 40-hour training session or curriculum that is developed by the North Carolina Justice Academy and is delivered by a trainer that is approved by the North Carolina Criminal Justice and Training Standards Commission. For example, here on slide 17, we pulled 4 of those course objectives, and they were pulled directly from the course catalog. They include essentially the concepts of the authority of SROs on schools and handling school matters, how to correctly address students in a classroom setting, recognizing and comparing disabilities covered under the Individuals with Disabilities Act, as well as identifying risk factors that our students face on a day-to-day basis when they have mental health challenges. As I mentioned earlier, SROs must also have CIT training. CIT programs provide law enforcement officers with the knowledge and skills they need to de-escalate persons that are in crisis. CIT programs also emphasize access to treatment services rather than an introduction to the justice system. The outcomes of the individuals and the officers are greatly improved when we have communities that work together in effective programs for the community for CIT programs. Next, I'll move on and talk a little bit about the training that we provide that is coordinated by the district and the security department. As we go throughout the year, we work collaboratively with stakeholders to identify areas of professional development for SROs. We look for areas that may enhance their skills and build capacity for them to assist them with their work in a school setting. Per our district MOU, we sponsor and coordinate at least 2 training opportunities a year. This is a training that actually started in 2014. Prior to 2014, we didn't have this. This is something that we added to the MOU in 2014, and I think it's been a great success as we're moving on. Those 2 training opportunities, what you'll see is we'll have the annual SRO Summit, which typically takes place in August, and its focus areas are SROs and Wake County School System school administrators that have SROs assigned to their schools. We also send an open invite. If anybody else is interested as far as school administrators, they're more than welcome to attend. And we have had some of the other elementary principals attend. That agenda is planned and coordinated by the security department. We also get input and collaboration from central services administrators, school administrators, law enforcement agencies, as well as Tharrington Smith plays a big hand in how we put together the agenda for that event. The second session that we have is the annual SRO guidance session. That typically takes place in January of the year. And again, with the agenda, we coordinate and we plan with central services administrators, school administrators, law enforcement agencies, and Tharrington Smith. And again, the primary target or focus for that group is the school resource officers. As we move to the next slide, I'm not going to go, the next several slides illustrate what we've done since the beginning of the addition of professional development provided for SROs. And what you're going to see is essentially, you'll notice two columns with the event title at the top. Every year during the summit, the presentations include aspects of the role of the SRO. Whether it's something that we present or Tharrington Smith presents, we will include the role of the SRO and, what their capabilities are within the class or within the school setting. Also, every year, Tharrington Smith puts together information to be shared with the group, and basically it's based upon areas of concern that we note through the year. We'll pick up different areas that we may have encountered. FERPA is a big one. You'll see that one dotted throughout, but we typically cover areas that we feel like we need to share that information. I'm not going to go through and read every one of the topics out, but I am going to point some of them out, if you don't mind. Again, you'll see the two different columns on the next several slides. One is the actual, what we covered in the summit. The other would be in that school year for the guidance session. For example, in 2014, we had Campbell Law come and present to the group on their Restorative Practices program. Also of note, in 2015, you'll notice we had an area where we covered and had collaboration from Central Services Administrators to provide a presentation on ensuring equitable discipline practices, as well as we had the state juvenile court system come and do a presentation on DMC trends across the state in reference to juvenile referrals. In 2016-17, you'll note that we had a collaboration, included a presentation from the Alliance Behavioral Group. And what you'll also notice through here, you might notice some of the topics linking up, but what I would say is we learn from these as we do them. We get valuable information, and when we're setting up these, the next agenda, sometimes they connect. Sometimes it's a continuation of what we had before, because we've seen it and gotten the feedback that this is valuable information. So you'll notice on slide 23, for 2017-18, we brought Alliance back again. They wanted to present again, and it was a very good presentation. Also, as I noted earlier, we've covered FERPA several times during different presentations with Tharrington Smith, but we also had a specific presentation that was entirely on FERPA in 2017-18. In 2018-19, we had Central Services folks in. We had our special education team presenting on best practices when engaging BST students. And then especially proud of one of the efforts that year. This is the first time that we collaborated with the school, Enloe High School, and the school administration and the students teamed up and did a presentation on equity outcomes. That one was so successful that we had them back for a different presentation, similar topic, but we had them back for the whole group for the summit, I believe, in 2019-20, and again, a presentation where school administration and students teamed up and provided a presentation on equity outcomes. We also have had an outside speaker come in, and this one went over really well. We had a presentation on generational bridge building through the lens of diversity and inclusion. What I'll say is that we continue to work very hard toward providing professional development opportunities to support the SRO program. So at this time, what I'll say is that this is the end of the presentation, but I'll be more than happy, or we will be more than happy to answer any questions that you might have in reference to the training that's out there.
So Mrs. Cash, and then we'll go to Mrs. Kushner.
I just wondered, what is the training that we give our principals, like in high schools and middle schools, on how to use the SRO?
Okay, that's a very good question, Ms. Cash. So as somebody is placed within the SRO program, from a standpoint of the school administration, one is we do cover the role of the SRO in the training each and every year. So a representative from the school is coming every year to gather the information that, the proper use of an SRO and the role, and we cover different aspects of it. The other thing that we do when it's a new school administrator, one of my team members will actually sit down with and actually have a conversation with them as well as the SRO to lay the foundation and how we're supposed to operate when it comes to the use of an SRO. It's a good question, but there's always room for improvement in that area.
Ms. Kushner.
Thank you, and thanks for the presentation, Mr. Smith. And I think in the past we've had some churn in our SROs that have been assigned to our schools, and last time we spoke, I think you'd said that had gotten better. But what is the stability and consistency in the actual law enforcement officer who are assigned? Because we don't assign them, right? They're assigned through the law enforcement agency. What does that look like now? Do we have more longevity? I would think this professional development helps because they're becoming professionalized in this specific role as a school resource officer. Has that helped with longevity and stability so that we're having less turnover?
So I think that's a great question, and probably one that we probably should do a better job of tracking. What I can tell you is based upon what I'm seeing. We have some officers that have been there for years, and they do a great job. We have some of the turnover, but I don't think it's due to a lot of the turnover is not due to job performance. It's due to them advancing their career. What you have at the school level is regular officers, and when they go through that progression of a career advancement, they're going to be moved out of the program. So I think we're seeing that.
Because that raises the issue of the consistency of you're offering great topics
I
in your
understand.
professional development, but we need to, and if someone comes in, right after August or January, then they're going a long time without any professionalization into being an SRO.
That's a very good point, and one that we certainly can work at to maybe address some of those issues so that they don't miss out on some of the opportunities.
And we have teacher work days. Maybe that could be someday that we bring in all the SROs for a program that you might have, given that those are once a month, and that might be one opportunity to have those officers come in and get that added professionalization if we're seeing that churn. So thank you.
Thank you.
Mrs. Scott.
Thank you. And my question was actually really similar to Ms. Kushner's. I was curious how SROs are chosen from the law enforcement organization to then, is that consistent across municipalities and the sheriff's office? Is this something that officers volunteer for, or is this something that they're selected? How does that usually work?
So that's a really good question, Ms. Scott. So there is not a lot of consistency, I don't think, in how officers are selected typically because they want to be in a school. The opening comes up, and I would say, and I can't say that for every agency, but typically most agencies, this is an area where an officer wants to be, and they are selected through a selection process within that particular department. But I can't say that that's the case 100% across the board. I will say that there are some that I've learned that is actually it's almost as if it's a promotion to be in a school. The pay may be different or something of that nature. So there's a lot of competition to get in schools. And also, in a lot of agencies, I believe it's a requirement at some point in time if you're going to move up the chain as far as your career ladder, that it's helpful that you have maybe not have been a school resource officer, but have been in different areas. So that would be an area that would be attractive as well. All of that being said, there is no consistency. I don't believe. It's not all done the same way within every agency.
Thank you. And when officers are selected to be placed within those schools, does your department ever have any jurisdiction over, reviewing those suggestions, or is it just that's the officer that is then assigned to that school?
Currently, the way that is handled, they are assigned by the agency, and with very little input from the school district. I have been involved in a situation or two in the past where we have been included, but that's been rare.
Thank you for that. I appreciate it. Thank you.
And Ms. Scott, I would just like to jump in and note one aspect of the MOU that I think somewhat speaks to your question. First, on page 2 of the SRO MOU, there is an articulation of, in addition to the standards Russ talked about, the standard that no one who's appointed to or recommended to be an SRO should have any substantiated history of improper use of force, harassment, discrimination, et cetera. So there is that kind of additional standard layered on top of the training standards that Russ talked about. So I just wanted to note that. And additionally, the district, specifically the superintendent, reserves the right to bar an SRO from campus at any time if the superintendent determines that the SRO poses any sort of threat to the health or safety or other educational interests of students. So certainly if there were a serious dispute about the appropriateness of the suggestion or assignment of an SRO, there's a vehicle for the district to respond to that, communicate with the agency, and have for some time a bar against that SRO serving on campus.
And I appreciate that clarification, but I did just want to offer that my question was more about like the initial assignment of an SRO to a school, but I appreciate that clarification on how to handle problems should they arise. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Scott. Mr. Haggerty.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Sutton. Thank you, Mr. Smith, for your presentation today. A lot of good information in here. I am just trying to learn a little bit more about the process and the training and some of the information that is a part of it. And so just I have a couple questions. The first one, can you tell us a little bit more about this, like the student-led equity outcome training? That was interesting to me. What does that look like in the training? Can you describe it, talk about the form it takes, and what's been the response to that? I know you said it was popular and it came back, but I mean, I didn't know if you had any specific comments or feedback from the
So I'm going to pass that along to Kendrick Scott, who actually is the coordinator for this event and actually coordinates the lineup there. Kendrick, if you won't mind.
Sure. So just to give you a brief heads up of kind of how that training happened, we had the SRO from Enloe along with students that came in, and they did a myriad of things. It was led by the principal, Dr. Chavis, at the time. They did some role-playing incidents of how the SRO and students interact with each other in the training piece, and then they did a very, not to say prolonged, but a very good speech from two students, just kind of explaining how they feel about having the SROs in the building and what their relationship was with the officer that works at Enloe. And so we did that. It was really well received. And when they came back the second time, they did something that's kind of similar. They did some more role playing and some kind of how this appropriateness between the SRO and the student interactions would go to show other SROs kind of what they did at Enloe that's a little bit maybe different from what the middle school or other high schools are.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. I appreciate that. In addition, when you put, and I'm going to stick with you if you don't mind, are you the one that's responsible for putting together the agenda and sort of the training itinerary for each of the programs?
Yeah, so what we do is we'll take a look at past programs and then any trends. We reach out to the law enforcement community, all the 11 agencies, and ask them if they have a specific topic that they want to talk about or some information that they want to bring forward. We also ask a lot of the principals, hey, is there something that you all want to talk about? And then we just kind of sit down and make sure we're not repeating something that we did the year before to make sure that they're getting something that's valuable that they didn't repeat from one year to the next.
Okay, I appreciate that. I'll tell you, I have been involved in the past with continuing education and training of judicial officials. And, we would do an annual conference each year for, like, for example, judges at different levels in association with other training organizations. One of the things that we did is, we would have a section at each conference where if there had been incidents of misconduct or if, someone had been disciplined or removed, or even if it was in another jurisdiction, we would try to use those as teachable moments, trying to walk through them, explain what the issue was, and, ask participants how they might have handled it differently, what the correct remedy was, creating some dialogue and trying to get participation where it wasn't just us telling them this is what you need to do, but getting everybody to talk about incidents, try to get recognition and awareness of where things might have gone wrong, and then kind of getting everyone on board on how to fix it. Is there a place for something like that in this training, or do you think that's just a different animal?
So what I would offer to you is a couple things. Every year, we try to have Mara O'Keefe come in and talk with us, and she runs through case law all the time. And when she does that, that is similar to kind of what you're talking about. She'll go over specific incidences and how the law is applied and how the SRO reacted to or a student reacted to a certain situation that brought along those case law things that she mentions. We did have, which I think was probably one of the better trained drills, I guess, that we did, was we had a situation where we would do a slide that would be a narration of an incident. We had the SRO sit with their principal, and they had a clicker that would basically say, we would have like a yes or no or true false, how they could answer, and they could sit together. We would read them the situation that could happen in a school, whether it's a middle school or a high school, and then the SRO and the principal would sit together and talk. The entire room we'd give them about 10 minutes or so to talk through it. They would record their answers, and then we would stand up and give them, hey, this is what should have happened, this is how this should have gone, and it gives them an opportunity to talk together, to collaborate together, come up with what they would do in their school, and then we would give kind of a general overview of, hey, this is really how we expect this to be handled. So it's similar to what you're talking about. I think it's probably the closest thing we've done, and we try to do that as much as we can.
Great, I appreciate it. I know this kind of gets down into a level of detail, maybe more than you'd normally bring up, but it helps us understand it, so I appreciate you taking the time today. Thank you.
No problem, sir. Thank you for your question.
Thank you, Mr. Hagerty. Ms. Mahaffey.
Thank you, Chair Sutton. Thank you, Mr. Smith and Mr. Scott, for taking the time to talk about the training that our SROs receive, not only as mandated by the state and their own law enforcement agency, but what we've done as a district to help bring that out. I know for some of our administrators and teachers, the SRO becomes part of the team when that relationship works well. And we've also seen incidents in our district where that does not work well. And so I think these conversations are crucial in order to build that relationship and make sure that we're hearing from folks in our district on what's working well, what isn't working well, and then sharing that in the training. I'm curious, and this is off of Mr. Haggerty's question about what leads to the decisions for the training. We talked to the law enforcement agencies and administrators, but we have in our high schools and in some of our middle schools and even elementary schools, student councils and student-based or student equity teams. Have we reached out to our students for any feedback on what they would like to see that relationship look like? And if the answer is no, perhaps maybe that's a possibility for the future. Thank you.
So other than the partnerships that we've had to have the NLO students come in, the answer is we've not reached out to students, but I think that's a very valid observation, and one that we certainly can look at implementing moving forward.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Mahaffey. Ms. Johnson-Hostler.
Sorry about that. My computer's a little slow today. Thank you both, Mr. Smith and excuse me, for your presentation and providing quite a bit of feedback. My colleagues have asked a few of my questions, so I do want to go back to one thing, and I think Ms. O'Keefe was answering this question, which was not Ms. Scott's question, but it sparked another question for me, which was, Ms. O'Keefe, you talked about there is in the MOU the language around the discretion of the superintendent when there's an issue with the SRO. We talked, as Ms. Cash asked earlier, about the training. So is that clear to principals in terms of some of the interactive work that you're doing? Is what does that process look like if they indeed feel the need to rise to that level to the superintendent? Do they have clarity on what that process looks like?
Well, I can tell you from my perspective, based on kind of what we've added into the SRO MOU, would be the answer to that question, and then I defer, of course, to Russ to elaborate on that. One of the things that I think Russ and his office have worked hard to do in the last year is come up with faster solutions to any disagreements or disputes that arise between the SRO and the school administrator. I think those sometimes come up when we're talking about access to records. An SRO might feel like I should be entitled to look at this student's file because I have a concern, for example, about gang affiliation. The administrator might say, respectfully, I disagree. We're at the same training. I read that training differently. One thing we've kind of added into the SRO MOU and also communicated with other law enforcement agencies about is that at the moment where there is disagreement over conduct of the SRO, even concerns by the SRO about conduct of an administrator or a teacher, each of those individuals are to immediately report to their supervisor. At the law enforcement agency for the SRO, and then on the school district side, the administrator is directed to report to Russ Smith exactly what the concern is. And then those supervisors are supposed to reach out to the other one at either the agency or the school district immediately. So I think that there is, in the last year, there's been more of an effort, and in the language to the SRO MOU, create a clearer pathway to resolve those issues and make sure any dispute comes to the attention of decision makers sooner rather than later. As you can imagine if SROs are part of a school-based team, if there are disputes, if there's even just a disagreement in interpretation of the SRO MOU, we want that ironed out now, not in a week, not in a month, because it might impact other decisions. As to whether that has extended to school administrators' understanding of the superintendent's authority to decide effectively that an SRO shouldn't access campus, I don't have a good sense of whether the administrators have a good understanding of that authority and of the opportunity to express that concern to their school administrator and then up through that same kind of chain of command to Russ Smith. I think Russ would be better positioned to kind of answer that question.
Okay. So in reference to there being an issue or a complaint, and I'm assuming what we're talking about here is if a parent or a student has an issue with an SRO, they are encouraged, obviously, to reach out to that law enforcement agency, but we also have a means for them to contact us to file a complaint or an issue. Now, what we do with that information once we get it is we document and are going to send that information to the law enforcement agency so that they can deal with it. I encourage them when they come to me to go to them as well, because I don't want it to be just left on the district, because they're not our employee. But what we do want to make sure is that it's looked at, it's reviewed, and then it's handled appropriately.
Thank you. I appreciate the extensive response that both of you have given. And again, I certainly do recognize they're not our employees. That's why I was asking specifically about process. So thank you for giving a robust answer to that. Excuse me. My next question, which again, I appreciate the interactive training and think that shows a great deal of difference. I'm also curious with Mr. Chavis and his students coming, were you able, and I would assume this may be the case, but were you able to talk about some of the difficult issues that the students, specifically from INLO, have expressed to us about disparities in the SR referrals, or was it a little bit more broader and didn't get into the details of some of the actual concerns expressed?
I don't know about you.
So actually, I'll talk about the very first time that happened. I think it was probably the most enlightening, which is why we asked them to come back. There was an African-American female student and male student that basically gave a testimony as to how they felt about law enforcement being in the building, is where they started with that conversation. And they did that at the guidance session, so it was nothing but police officers in the room that heard it. And they took a lot away from, I feel like they took a lot away from hearing that. And it was a direct, I remember looking at the feedback, was the SROs actually liked hearing more from the kids that came, and I think he brought 4 students total that day. He just kind of facilitated the talk, but the students did all the presenting and all the talking about their relationship with their SRO, how they feel in general with SROs in the building. But yeah, it was I don't know if you want to call it a crucial conversation, but it was a very good conversation, and I think it was one that needed to be had, and I think they learned a lot from it when they did hear it.
Thank you. That's certainly helpful, and sounds like it's on the right track for me. I mean, of course, you all know the next step for me is the crucial conversations to really, I think we can only do the best job with our SRO officers when we're clear with them with some of the concerns, and we're actually, looking at the nuts and bolts of the disparities specifically with them. I think that's when we'll see the change. And I know our district has done a great job in other ways of having courageous conversations, and I certainly feel like you all have laid the groundwork to do that with the students. And I also think they're probably the best teachers. So thank you.
Mr. Smith, I had a question. Going back to the I think it was slide 16 that had to do with the in-service hours. If I remember correctly, it was 24 hours of in-service training, 14 of which are mandated by the state, 10 of which by the local agency. And I guess this is somewhat both for you and Ms. O'Keefe, in terms of the 10 hours from the local agency, have we had, and in the past, have we had any input on the 10 of those 10 hours of in-service training? And is there an opportunity for us to collaborate with the local agencies on what that 10 hours entails or looks like? And if not, is there an opportunity to collaborate and have something in the MOU that would allow us to do that? Is that something that we could ask for? Or is there a feeling like, well, we've got, because I see some of the training that's offered here, and you could argue that there is a fair amount of input that we have in that, but I guess I'm looking particularly at those 24 hours of in-service training that are probably really the bulk of the training that they get.
So again, I'll start off and then defer to Russ to finish if he has additional information. So to my knowledge, Chair Sutton, we have not been asked to provide input or feedback into what those additional 10 in-service hours consist of. What I can say is that I am in contact with legal counsel specifically for the Sheriff's Department and Raleigh PD throughout the course of the year. They have always readily partnered with us, whether it's taking a look at draft FERPA guidance and signing on to that, or kind of looking at my PowerPoint slides in advance of a summit presentation and letting me know whether there are additional issues they want to hit on. So we were pretty solicitous of inviting them to participate and provide feedback when we present, and I've gotten the strong sense from them that they would also welcome that input. So I think we could certainly find opportunities to ask them kind of for clarity, kind of what is being covered, and is there possibility to emphasize topics A, B, and C based on what Russ and his colleagues have seen arise in the past calendar year.
I mean, obviously that's their domain, but I just wonder if that opportunity for us to at least have some input and collaborate might exist in that.
I agree with what Ms. O'Keefe said, and I would take it a step further. It's not going to hurt us to ask. I think we certainly should reach out to see if there's. We certainly would not want to address, like Raleigh, for example, all of their officers, but certainly the ones that are assigned as SROs and/or supervisors. We certainly, I think they would be willing to listen to what we'd have to say. Now, whether they'd agree, might be another thing, but I think we owe it to reach out.
And I think, and I guess it might be more a statement, just input. And I appreciate most of the focus on equity, diversity, inclusion, but some of that might also involve a lot of training around culture and climate, and working with our principals and what that culture and climate looks like. I mean, some might argue that that's the same as equity, diversity, and inclusion, but I feel like that's a little bit different sort of piece in terms of training, and they are a part of that sort of school, campus, and community, and an integral part of that. And so how we, have more of an inclusive culture and climate, I think would be an important part of that sort of local piece. Ms. Mahaffey.
Chair Sutton, I was just thinking with your question, as we discussed a little earlier of seeing which SROs have been with our schools for how long, and maybe keeping also, as we're keeping track of that, what training they've received either from Wake County or their own law enforcement agency, so we can see where there's crossover between departments or where maybe there are gaps that we can fill if one police department is focused on a particular topic over another. But I would imagine that they have some coordination as well with their own professional organizations and training organizations, but just for our own purposes of just knowing what's being offered. Thanks.
Ms. Cash.
Well, again, I mean, I would love for us to have our principals of some of our high schools that have had really good working relationships weigh in on what better training we need for them, or even for the SROs. I think they can tell you what has worked and what has not worked, so would love to have their input as well.
And I've got a question similar to that, and that's probably directed more to Superintendent Moore. And the part in the MOU that talks about where you have the authority to not approve the assignment of any SRO or what have you. And I do rightfully think that authority should be yours. But at what level of input do the principals have, or do you consult, I guess, with the principals in that decision? Because obviously they've got certain officers that I imagine, not just their SRO, but other officers that the school or the school community is part of their beat patrol or what have you. And so they would have some sense, particularly when they work football games and other athletic events, that they have a sort of on-the-ground knowledge or sense of what officers might work better or what have you, than, say, you or I or anybody here in central office might have, if that's a fair question.
I'll just start, and then I'll let Russ finish, because it's not been very often that we've had discussions about removing an SRO officer. And whether I was in my former role or current role, I am aware of what the issues are. The principal is always engaged and involved in that discussion. And I guess it depends on where the issue is stemming from, who else might be involved in that discussion. So I would just say that I am aware, and should that action need to be taken, it could be taken. I don't know that we've gotten to that point specifically, but I'll let Russ speak a little bit more specifically with the history of how that's happened.
Thank you, Ms. Moore. That's a very accurate description. We've not gotten to that point where we've had to go through that particular step. We've been very fortunate with the relationships that we have with the agencies that we have out there. When issues have come up, the agencies, in any case where we would be thinking about heading in that direction, the agencies have pulled the officer. And so we've not actually had to go down that path. I don't want to mention any cases specifically, but we have had a few issues over the years where, based upon the circumstances, it really wouldn't be fair for anyone involved for the officer to remain in place. And so there have been steps that have been taken, but it's been from the outside agency that has taken the steps. We've not been put in a position where we've had to go out and reach and ask for somebody to be removed. Does that answer the question that you were asking?
Yes, sir.
I would add one bit more, that the principals are very active when it comes to this. You know, they provide information if they have issues or concerns. They're not just sitting there waiting for, you know, they've got concerns. You know, we get out there and try to address them as quickly as possible with school administrators if it's something that can be addressed. If it's something that can't be addressed as far as improving the situation with the officer at hand, then we have the other conversations. You know, in the end, the last step would be based upon the documentation that I would have, and per the MOU, I would take that information and share it with the superintendent, and the superintendent would be able in a position to make the decision.
Okay. One final question. And I guess it's part of sort of the crucial conversation that Ms. Johnson-Hosler was referring to. So I just want to, I think I'm going to ask this question. So our principals rely on our SROs quite heavily, I believe, and understandably so. Because of the training that our SROs have gone through, to your knowledge, have we ever had an SRO who was asked, I guess, or brought or invited into a situation and they pushed back or said, hey, this is probably not something that's appropriate for me, or that I ought to be involved in as a law enforcement officer, that's more sort of in the school or principal domain and not appropriate, for lack of a better word, to engage in? Is that
so? I guess the best way for me to address this would be to say that over the course of years, we've gotten better and better and better as a school district in operating and utilizing our SROs in a fashion of the way that they're supposed to be utilized. You know, going back to, and I know y'all probably don't like to hear all these old stories, but, you know, when I became the senior director in 2005, there was no MOU, and it was rampant. And there was no consistency at all in the way SROs were utilized. It was all over the place. And so that was part of the steps that we've taken over the years to put things in place so that we do have a structure and a template to follow. So the MOU is clearly in place to provide guidance for how SROs are to be utilized by school administrators. Is it followed 100%? I can't stand up here and tell you that that's the case. But I will say that we're light years ahead of where we were, and we're always continuing to try to improve the processes that we have in place to make sure that they're only being utilized for areas that they should be utilized in.
If I could just add to that, I've had the opportunity to speak to the SROs and administrators at a number of the kickoff trainings at the beginning of the year, and one of the things that we work really hard as a district to sort of maintain as something to think about, and I have spoken these words to the SROs in the audience and the administrators in the audience, and it goes something along the lines of, generally speaking, SROs are not first responders for classroom discipline. And you have to think about that just a little bit, right? So that if there's an issue in a classroom, that's really something that teacher, administrators deal with those issues with students. And that the involvement of the SRO is not even a thought at that particular point in time for the vast majority of those incidents. So, and understanding that, so that how they build those relationships and expectations from each other at the school level in terms of when an SRO is needed, that be like an explicit direction from an administrator on a walkie-talkie or a radio or something along those lines, that an SRO is needed, as opposed to them being the first responder to a call that comes into the office about something that's going on in a classroom or an issue that may be in the hallway or something along those lines. And that does there's an ebb and flow to all of that, because each situation is individual and can start as something and end up as something else. And there are all kinds of factors that impact that. But I think the MOU, as Russ has spoken, has gone a long way towards helping define that better. And then it's really how that gets implemented at the school level. And like you said, there may be times when it is blurred and it's not doesn't land neatly where you may have expected it to. But again, there's a process to work through that, and that does take time. And I think we're generally fortunate that many of our SROs do remain in place for multiple years in schools. I'm not sure what the turnover rate is like.
And that's certainly something we can look at, the turnover rate. But I guess a finality would be the final part to what you're talking about, Mr. Sutton, is that, yes, we have had situations where the school resource officer said that's not an area I need to be involved in. Sometimes it was merited, sometimes not, but the communication is really good. I think they work really well together. Of course, they're like any relationship. You know, they're not all going to be great relationships, but our school resource officers and our school administrators, I mean, our principals do a great job. I'll end it with that.
No, I agree, and I think in a way I appreciate the work of our principals, and they have a tough job, and I think part of the reason why we're even here and sort of having some of this discussion, it's a judgment call oftentimes. And you're sometimes reacting to action and adrenaline and everything else, and our principals in the heat of the moment sort of have to make a decision or a call. And I guess I'm acknowledging the difficulty of that job, and I think the amazing job that they have done and the work that the MOU has done over the years in helping to provide some level of consistency around that and a roadmap to that, so that judgment and reaction is sort of not all over the place, and bringing some consistency to that. Well, at the same, and I think sometimes we struggle with the MOU in trying to make sure that whatever happens in high schools across the county, no matter where you are, the outcomes and the things are the same, but at the same time, allowing enough room for that flexibility and judgment. So I'm glad to hear that over the years since the MOU has been present, that there's some improvement, even if that's difficult to measure because it's a fine line, I think, sometimes. I don't know. Mara, I see you sort of nodding. And
Yeah, I'm nodding just because I think it is a really difficult line to draw, but I'll just note, and I think Mr. Hagerty asked about this earlier, kind of whether there's an opportunity in training to add some hypotheticals. And pretty much every year during the course of the year, Russ Smith or others on his team will let me know if there's any sort of disagreement with the local law enforcement agency about how a specific incident was handled. And I'm aware of several occasions where school administrators and law enforcement have had difficult, but I think really helpful conversations where a school administrator has said, respectfully, we don't need law enforcement's assistance with this. This is a kind of a category yellow. It's moderate misconduct. It's more serious than just calling out in class, but we can handle it. And we think under the SRO MOU, we don't need law enforcement intervention. And every year I try to bake in some hypotheticals based on incidents that have actually come up at high schools. So we'll add a couple differentiating facts, but we'll pretty much follow a fact pattern. I think most recently a lot of them have been hypotheticals that involve some sort of threatening statement communicated by social media, communicated on the bathroom wall. Not surprisingly, because of the increase in school shootings over the last few years, that was an increased concern of administrators and law enforcement. How can we get on the same page in deciding who responds to that? And although there's no cookie cutter response, I do think that the annual training provides a nice opportunity to just offer as many hypotheticals as possible. I think those are the most valuable tool for administrators to sit with their SROs and really grapple with, how would we handle that? How have we handled it? Have we handled it improperly before? So I apologize for nodding too much, but I really think these conversations are difficult and important, and it is a really difficult line to draw for school administrators.
Another thing I would add, and just quickly, we've got one more topic to cover. As you talk about the hypotheticals, how a lot of agencies are now addressing some of that because there's no cookie cutter is to the point that you can simulate interactions and that sort of thing. And a lot of agencies, both in law enforcement, even the health profession, you're seeing now virtual, the VA, I think they were using the simulated training to create as much as you can a real life situation where then officers have to react to a situation. Do you see any of that coming on the horizon for training, particularly for SROs? I know that's a part of other law enforcement type things, but is that some sort of a virtual reality? That's what I'm thinking about, VR, virtual reality for use in training.
I don't have a strong sense of kind of how soon those possibilities might be here. It's something I'd be happy to talk to colleagues in law enforcement about. I imagine they're using some of that technology in the trainings they do. In any event, it certainly would be interesting and helpful to know whether some of that technology could be applied to SRO and school administrator trainings. I do think in the meantime that kind of some of the tabletop exercises that Russ and Kendrick spoke about earlier, where SROs and administrators from the same school have the same set of facts, and in a time crunch they have to respond on a clicker indicating this is what we would do. I think that's as close as we can probably get without knowing more about that technology, but it's certainly something I can get an answer to in short order, Chair Sutton.
Okay. Dr. Martin.
Yeah, just listening to this discussion, I think we've made huge progress, as you noted, in terms of the role and in terms of the training. The broad picture, I think, is moving very much in the right direction. But I think what gets to some of the issues that I think I hear you raising is what is our mechanism for addressing, reporting when things go wrong? And I think that's the thing that we talk about in terms of probably what needs some of the most significant work in the MOU update is what is our, for lack of a better term, a grievance structure. When something goes wrong, how do we report it? How do we respond to that? Because in any system like this, right, we're doing the best we can with training, with administrators, with SROs, with everybody. You're not going to get a perfect situation, like you noted, Mr. Smith. You can't stand here and say it works right every time. There's going to be times where it doesn't work right. And so how do we, I think possibly our next step is how do we build a more effective response to when it doesn't go right? That's not to say that we think it's not going right all the time. That's not to wag the fingers at administrators or SROs, but just a real acknowledgement that stuff isn't going to go right every time. That's a reality of a system as large as ours. So can we put in place an effective structure to deal with the when it doesn't work right? And I really think that would move us to the next level in our MOU, in our organization.
Thank you, Dr. Martin.
All right, yeah, thank you for that. All right, we've got one more topic, and the same two, Mr. Smith and Mr. Scott, talking a bit about offense referral data for middle schools and high schools. So we can just move right into that.
Yes, sir. So for the next item on today's agenda, we're going to be looking at an overview of the district referral offense data for the school years 2017 through 2020, with an emphasis on showing the differences between middle schools and high schools. So at this time, I'm going to turn the podium over to Senior Administrator Kendrick Scott.
All right, good afternoon, Board Chair Sutton, Superintendent Moore, and Board of Education members. This afternoon, we are here to further unpack the previous data presented to you during the last committee meeting. Based upon your feedback at that time, we are providing a breakdown of offense types for middle school and high schools for school years 2016-17 through 2019-20. Just as a reminder, the 2019-20 school year reflects the shortened school year due to the COVID-19 pandemic. This is indicated by an asterisk and footnote at the end of each data chart slide. This slide is a visual representation of the WCPSS district totals for high school and middle school offenses for the top 5 offenses from the 2017-18 through the 2019-20 school years. As you may recall from our previous presentation on offense types, the top 5 identified offenses are assaults, controlled substance, larceny, possession of a weapon, and multiple offense categories. In this slide, there is a decline between 2017 and 2018 overall and across most major offense categories. Data from the partial year in 2020 suggests that the 2018 numbers were largely holding steady compared to 2019. And this chart here we're showing represents the Raleigh Police Department, which provides SROs for high schools only. You will notice that there is a decline from 2017 to 2018 and across most major offense categories. Data from the partial year in 2020 suggests that those 2018 numbers were largely holding steady compared to 2019. And this slide is a visual representation of the Wake County Sheriff's Office referrals. As a reminder, please note that the Sheriff's Office provides SROs primarily at the middle schools, and you will notice that which are almost all at the middle school level, the numbers had dipped from 2019 but then increased in 2020, showing higher levels through mid-March compared to the prior full school year. Numbers at the high school were also up, but very few overall. And this slide is a visual representation of all other law enforcement agencies and other municipalities. As a group, those numbers were up in 2019, but appeared to be declining slightly in 2020. If we interpolate what the 2020 figures might have looked like had the school year not been shortened by a quarter, those middle school and high school referral numbers appeared to be on track to come in slightly lower than in 2019. Board Chair Sutton, Superintendent Moore, and Board of Education members, that concludes our presentation for today, and we'd be happy to entertain any questions at this point.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. Any questions from board members?
I got the easy part.
Dr. Martin.
Thank you, as always, for the data. And I think I was asking about this a little bit the last time we looked at this as well. But is there a way that we can parse out what all goes into the category of, say, assault, for example? Because when we see things in due process hearings and various other places, assault feels to me like it spans a huge range from true assault to somebody got shoved. Those are probably the two extremes. But when we look at the assaults where an SRO got engaged, where is that range? And is there some attention we should apply to that? I mean, clearly it seems the SRO should only, in my mind, only be engaged in the more extreme that anybody could agree with as an assault, whereas not so much on the other end. So can you help us understand the breadth of what lands in the assault charge?
So I'll give you two things. First, based on your comments previously, I went back and just kind of looked up the general statute wording for assault. And again, I'm not an attorney and I'm not a police officer, but I can tell you that when you do read the general statute, the words assault, simple assault, assault and battery, and affray, they're all in the same general statute. So I think it's kind of, from a law enforcement perspective, it's kind of synonymous, all of those terms. I don't think they would call a garden variety fight. It's if someone has been assaulted, they use all those terminologies in what the general statute is. Now, I can give you my experience from being in the field for 13 years of how kind of the individual incidents, and they're all individual, so it's not like you can put a cookie cutter and say this is a fight and this is an affray and this is a garden variety fight. But in general, when the SRO is involved, I think, as we talked about a little bit previously, the principal and the SROs, they have a really good working relationship. I don't typically have seen, in my experience working in the field, a garden variety fight and a principal automatically calling the SRO just because of that. I think it's got to be something much more egregious before they reach out to their SRO. And I don't see SROs, from my experience of working with them, running out just because two kids shoved each other.
The reason I raised the issue is this is where these kinds of things are the areas where I hear the most complaints. And so that suggests that there is at least some miscommunication from the official response and sometimes the complainant response.
If I could add a dimension to what Dr. Martin is relaying, because one of the ways that this happens is the definitions in the Red Book around disciplinary infractions versus the standard of law that is applied by an officer in a case. And so the extent to which there is alignment or not alignment, or terms are sometimes used interchangeably that shouldn't be used interchangeably. And are we talking about the Red Book? Are we talking about a standard of law? And when in the Red Book is the standard law apply and when is it not? That sort of thing. And so all of that causes confusion sometimes in how things are explained to parents, either by an administrator or a school resource officer. And I think there's always going to be space there for continued refining, better communication, just even saying what I just said in some cases so that folks understand that they are different. And I just wanted to think, I think that's kind of where part of what you're saying comes from. And certainly if the folks have anything to add, that would be helpful.
I could agree. And like I said, the reason I raise it is because this is where I hear, I think, the biggest disconnect. You know, that the kids were punished and went to law enforcement because of, and the of where does it fit into the bucket? And yeah, there aren't clean lines, but I think that's where we have some work to maybe improve.
I had one other point that I would like to add, and it's another factor. But when Ms. Moore was just giving her description, I heard her mention parents. And there are times that we don't involve SROs, and when something happens, the parents of one of the kids involved feels like their child may be a victim, and they may have been, where they actually reach out to the SRO and get them involved. And when that happens, there's not a whole lot of choice if somebody wants to press charges in reference to an assault or a fray of that nature. Thefts are another issue. Aside from that, when you're talking about items such as cell phones and other devices that become stolen, while we may not get law enforcement involved or the SRO involved, parents may. And so that's something that's out of our control and it's out of the SRO's control.
And if the parent gets the SRO involved, that would come through this reporting as well?
Correct.
Ms. Johnson-Hostler.
Thank you again, Mr. Sutton. So I'm glad you asked the follow-up question. I didn't realize, mostly because I've gotten some complaints from parents who try to have a situation of they're believing their child was victimized, that they were told, and it was in middle school, the most recent one prior to us getting out in March, that SROs were not going to engage because the school didn't see this as an issue for the SRO officer. So again, I guess I'm always going to go back to the inconsistencies, which we know happen because of school-based decisions. But that is the first time I've heard that a parent can go back to the school and ask to engage a SRO officer.
Yes, it does. That totally happens. And with more frequency, I think, than the other way around.
That seems very odd to me. And so, I'll definitely want to have a follow-up on that. That I guess for me, I'm trying to visualize, and I said this to the parent who angrily called me, that, and honestly, what the SRO officer told the parent was, well, you should go to RPD and file a simple assault, which honestly, in my personal opinion, I was like, high five to the SRO officer, because if the school and the SRO officer in that moment at the school didn't see this as a need, then that to me was the appropriate response, because they had already determined that wasn't the case at the school, but it still gave the parent an outlet.
And let me clarify that just a little bit further. And You guys, let me know if this is actually correct. It is oftentimes it happens all three ways. It happens with a parent that comes back to the school unsatisfied with the school's response and wants to engage the SRO one-on-one. It happens when the SRO says there's no reason to engage. You can go to the municipal law enforcement agency and complain. Well, they will go speak to a sheriff or a deputy from the municipality who will then call the SRO to figure out what happened. When a school chooses not to involve law enforcement, there are a couple of different ways in which a parent who feels that is the appropriate avenue can attempt to do so, whether it is speaking directly to the SRO about it, or if the SRO has already told them no, going to the municipal law enforcement agency and trying to go through it in that manner.
Thank you for the clarification. I guess for me, then I can see why there's a lot of confusion for SRO officers on where the boundaries are if there's, again, that type of variance. I don't have an answer to that, and I feel like because it's the first time I'm hearing it, I need to process a little more of if the principal and SRO have made a decision. How do we determine then that somebody else can come back and ask the SRO officer to redetermine the decision? And I don't need an answer to that now, but because I need to process it. I did not realize that was an option. So I'm glad the follow-up question happened so we could hear that and talk through that. Sorry. later. My allergies are killing me today, so that's why I'm not in person with you all. My actual question goes back to when we're, and again, thank you, Mr. Scott, for answering the question. Excuse me, and Mr. Smith and Superintendent Moore for adding some more clarity around kind of what we see happening for those that are labeled as assaults. And again, I'm going to beat the drum again on, given the racial disparities, this is a place for me that, you know, more data of sorry, figuring out that are we seeing that we're using assault if a student has already been in trouble? So if it's a Mr. Scott, I have not heard anybody say garden variety fight in a long time, so that took me back a little bit. But if it is a garden variety fight for student A who's not been in trouble, but if student B has been in trouble, then it becomes an assault legally. I don't know the answer, so I guess, you know, when we talk about data, I mean, that's a deeper data dive to see if we can actually see those distinctions. Again, back to when we're having student appeals, we certainly know that from those students who get in front of us are, of course, the most severe, that we can clearly see every time there's any issue with that student, almost always the SRO officer has been engaged at some level. And so when we talk about restorative practices, for me, if we're going to be doing restorative practices, some of that also means restoring faith back into that student. So for me, it's around creating the balance that we're not going to keep punishing the child if we're doing restorative practices. And we've brought in John Powell and his people, that we're actually giving those kids a second chance. And I'd like for us to look at, in those schools where we have restorative practices, are we able to see that we're truly restoring back into that community for that student? Or are we indeed following the pathway of, you've been in trouble 3 times, so now it's always going to be an assault for this student? And that's a deeper dive in our data. And maybe we just do it in a few where we have restorative practices to see if there are any trends.
Ms. Johnson-Hostler, can I restate that to make sure I understood you correctly?
Sure.
To what extent does a student's prior history impact the manner in which additional occurrences are handled with regards to potential referrals to law enforcement?
Yeah.
So that it's not just the standard of what the law, the language in the law says, but rather the more subjective history of the student.
Absolutely. And then, of course, I'd like to see if we actually see differences in our schools that are practicing restorative practices.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Johnson-Hostler. Ms. Mahaffey, as we wrap up.
Thank you, Chair Sutton. Ms. Johnson-Hostler spurred a question that I had. Last time, Mr. Smith and Mr. Scott, we talked about kind of the pathways once a student gets an SRO referral, where do they go? Whether it be teen court, whether it be through the restorative practice program with Campbell Law, a juvenile court in some capacity. And so I'm curious as to, you know, what is the impact on the student after the referral, going through those different modes of, I guess I'm trying to think of the term. So what is the impact on a student that goes through juvenile court in coming back to our schools, through restorative, through Campbell Law, or through teen court? What does that look like? And then I'm curious as to what is the racial makeup of the students that get referred to the different programs. And I understand that this is kind of a question for a future discussion, but just one that came up in mind as I was listening to some of the questions come through and looking at the data. Thank you.
All right. Just as we're coming to a close, I saw 2 more hands pop up. So Mr. Haggerty and then Mr. Blumberg, and we'll wrap up after that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And really, this is just a request for something in a future meeting, paying attention to the time that we have. I didn't have my hand up. I thought it might come out as an answer to Ms. Johnson-Hostler's question about assault. But I'd like to know if we can take a look at, again, some of the behaviors that, kind of could be borderline between what's criminal behavior and what's disciplinary behavior. Specifically when you get into things like disorderly conduct, right? Disorderly conduct, under what circumstances does disorderly conduct rise to a criminal matter where the SRO becomes involved, and where is disorderly conduct something that's addressed at the school level? And honestly, I'm curious if we've looked at, are there patterns, either school by school, individual schools, high school versus middle school? Do we see it happening more at some schools, less at other schools? Is it the SRO decision? Is it the principal decision? I just don't know. And so at a future meeting, if we could look a little closer into some of those. And again, just with assault, I didn't know if sexual assault is something that is thrown into those assault numbers or if that's treated separately. Again, respectful of the hour that we're in, I'm just hoping we could address those at a future meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hegarty. I see staff make a note of that, so we'll have that included. Mr. Blumberg.
Yeah, super fast and also mindful of the time. Again, great questions all day from the board. Just for the list of potential items for a future MOU with SROs, if the board goes in that direction, are some of the topics that came up today, including if the board's interested, of saying that any prior disciplinary behavior on the part of a student shall not be considered in determining whether there would be a referral to law enforcement, that it needs to be based on that incident, and that incident alone could be something that the board could consider if they wanted it in an MOU. And similarly, the board in your code of conduct, you clearly differentiate between a fight, aggressive behavior, which is a level 2, and then an assault, which really involves the potential for serious injury. And again, to see whether referrals can be more aligned with your code of conduct, more in line with that this would need to be a serious assault for referral purposes as opposed to what would be your level 2. So just some thoughts for a potential talking points, negotiations on a future MOU, again, if the board has an interest down the road, and I appreciate it.
Thank you, sir. Just as we come to a close and thinking about our next meeting, the fourth Wednesday, which is now our standard date for this committee, that date in November is the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, so we will not meet on that day. And then in December, the fourth Wednesday is December 23rd, which is 2 days before Christmas. The final Wednesday of the month, there are 5 Wednesdays, is December 30th, and I'm pretty certain that during that time we are on our Christmas break. So what we're looking at, because I do not want to cancel 2 meetings through November and December, so we will be trying to find a date somewhere in early December for a meeting. As soon as we determine what that date is, we will communicate that as soon as possible. There is quite a bit going on as we get into November and then to close the year. So we will be having a meeting, one final meeting before the end of the year. I can tell you that it won't be the fourth Wednesday in November or December. It will be a date in early December. As soon as we determine that date with staff, we'll let you know. All right. Again, thank you so much for your time and attention today, and we will declare this meeting of the Safety and Security Committee adjourned. Thank you so much.